The now empty Eastern State Penitentiary is a haunting relic looming over the city's skyline as a grim testament to America's past. Within these walls, the state employed such peculiar and harrowing methods of punishment that I wouldn't even be allowed to describe them on YouTube. And yet, surprisingly, this formidable institution was once considered a pioneer in reform. The history runs deep here, from Al Capone's designer cell to forgotten escape tunnels. So join us to find out what remains. This is the story of the Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start in colonial times, when jails and prisons were raunchy and corrupt businesses. You see, back then, many were commercial ventures filled with working girls, corrupt officials, chaos, and a little bit of alcohol for good measure. They were nothing more than holding pens for any sort of undesirables, holding normal people alongside petty criminals and violent offenders. Conditions were so bad that starvation, cold, disease, and violence often killed prisoners before they were even sentenced. In the 1700s, capital punishment was by far most common for serious crimes committed in the colonies. Retribution, also known as corporal punishment, was also common. This entailed physically injuring someone as a consequence of wrongdoing, which included flogging, maiming, branding, and even blinding. Flogging meant punishing a criminal with a whip or rod. Maiming was the forcible removal of extremities, and branding often involved a hot iron with a letter or symbol identifying a person's crime. Another form of punishment was the stocks or pillory, which restrained a prisoner as the crowd mocked and hurled stones or rotten food at them. These measures were reserved for less serious crimes in the colonies, such as dishonest trading or public intoxication. The stocks held you by the feet and forced you to sit up and face the stoning, while the pillory forced your head and hands into a wooden or metal frame, causing you to bend over for anywhere from half an hour to an entire day. It was a painful and humiliating experience. With that in mind, that's why it's no wonder that people began to question the nature of prisons and what was going on inside. Once the United States had secured their freedom in 1783, the Philadelphia citizens, led by Dr. Benjamin Rush, among others, began to reform the harsh penal code of 1718. The new code replaced severe punishment with public labor, while they began to take a closer look at the conditions of the Walnut Street Jail. Built in 1776 to relieve the overcrowding and disreputable conditions at Philadelphia's Old Stone Jail, Walnut Street Jail wasn't much of an improvement. Its disgraceful conditions, coupled with the public's reaction to convicts working in the streets, led to the creation of the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisoners, whose goal it was to correct issues in prisons which didn't take into consideration the age, gender, or nature of the crime for its prisoners. It was founded by Dr. Benjamin Rush in 1787 and was one of the first prison reform groups in the world, with Benjamin Franklin joining soon thereafter. Conception of the Eastern State was upon its creation. The group began looking into Walnut Street Jail and were shocked by the poor conditions, and so they presented an account of their investigations to the state legislature a year later, recommending solitary confinement and hard labor as an effective reformation strategy. This is because they thought being alone with your thoughts would give you time to reflect on your actions and therefore reform. So in 1790, 16 single cells were built in Walnut Street Jail to test the effectiveness of day and night solitary confinement, but that was only the beginning. After many years of lobbying, the Philadelphia Society received funding from the Pennsylvania legislature to build a new prison in 1821. What came to be known as Eastern State would be a new type of prison, featuring solitary confinement for all of its 250 prisoners, a measure that officials of the time believed encouraged penance, and what most would argue was the world's first major penitentiary. When Eastern State Penitentiary was constructed, it was one of the most expensive prisons ever made. with a price around $780,000, and is considered to be the first modern prison. The design of the penitentiary was decided by competition, with multiple architects submitting designs to be considered. In the end, John Haviland's won out. He was a British architect who had settled in Philadelphia and beat his rival, William Strickland, winning the $100 prize in the process. Construction began in 1821, and Strickland was chosen to oversee the project, but fired just a year later and replaced by his competitor. When Eastern State was conceived, solitary confinement didn't really exist as a concept. It hadn't been instituted in most prisons before, so this would be the first time to institute it in full force. The idea was to make prisoners feel truly alone, in order to repent for their crimes. To this end, the prison was designated with 250 prisoners in mind, each with their own cell for the entirety of their sentence. The entrance to each cell was a small door that forced prisoners to bow when entering or exiting the cell, as if to a higher power, encouraging a penitent attitude. This was reinforced by vaulted ceilings and skylights, which the architect claimed let God's light and wisdom shine down upon them. To prevent inmates from seeing guards or other prisoners, cells had so-called feed doors and personal exercise yards. And in a time when even the White House had no indoor plumbing, Eastern State had faucets and flushing toilets. The penitentiary had no cooling system, but in the winter, hot water was piped through the prison to provide brief relief from the cold. The prison was designed in a wagon wheel layout. 7 single-story cell blocks extended circularly around a central point, giving guards a clear line of sight virtually anywhere in the prison at any time. 2 cell blocks were completed before Eastern State opened in 1829, less than a week shy of Halloween. In 1831, cell block 3, the last of the original single-story cell blocks, was completed. From this point forward, cell blocks were built with 2 stories or more, as more and more people were incarcerated there. Cell blocks 4 through 7 were all built with 2 stories and were completed in 1835. In all, the prison covers 11 acres with 450 heated cells, not to mention state-of-the-art plumbing and sewage systems. It was a technological and architectural marvel, but even after the prison's creation, all was not well. In 1877, 4 new cell blocks needed to be built, this time without exercise yards, since they utilized space between existing cell blocks. However, after this, yet more space was needed. In 1911, cell block 12 was built between cell blocks 6 and 7, made of reinforced concrete and having 3 stories with 40 cells each. 12 had no arched ceilings or skylights, only narrow windows in each cell. Cell block 13 was opened between 1909 and 1926. Little is known about its early use, but one fact is clear. This was the block where most punishments were dealt. Known as the Hole, or the Klondike, it housed 10 dark, poorly ventilated cells with iron beds and barely enough room to breathe. Cells were about half the size of those found in normal prisons, often limiting the ability to stand, treatment that would constitute extreme cruelty by today's standards. The last block built was cell block 14 in 1926, a 3-story building that completely eliminated the last of the spaces between any other blocks. And it needs to be pointed out that a prison meant to hold 250 prisoners was now packed with 1,700, putting prisoners in a precarious situation, to say the least. So perhaps it would be prudent to point out that if you find yourself in that situation, or any other unjust situation for that matter, you might want to seek legal help immediately. Check out our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm, trusted by over 3 million people who have called them in their hour of need. Submitting a claim for injury doesn't have to be a burdensome process. In fact, you won't even need to visit law offices to protect yourself. You can submit a claim and have a lawyer review your case with only 8 clicks on your phone. Morgan & Morgan has modernized the injury law process, making it so easy to submit a claim. You can submit case details, sign contracts, upload documents, and medical records, all from your cell phone. Morgan & Morgan pretty much balanced the playing field, making support accessible because their clients don't have to fear upfront legal costs. They only pay if they win. So don't overthink it. Take action to protect your rights, and Morgan & Morgan will fight to get you the compensation you deserve. If you're ever injured in an accident, you can submit a claim at www.forthepeople.com/itshistory or by dialing #law. That's 529 on your phone. Thank you, Morgan & Morgan, for supporting the channel. And now, back to the Eastern State Penitentiary. Throughout the years, the compound saw many changes. On top of, or rather inside, new cell blocks, staff and prisoners alike have modified the facility to their needs. One of the first changes to Eastern State was Warden Michael Cassidy's impressive office space. He built the office for his work in the 1880s, but later wardens moved their offices into the administration building. This gave way for the religious staff, the Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic chaplains to move in. Another religious space constructed in the penitentiary was the Eastern State Synagogue, perhaps the first of its kind in an American prison. Built in 1924, the synagogue featured dark wooden benches, an arc reader's table, an ornate plaster Star of David, and an eternal flame. It remained a staple of Eastern State's religious community for the duration of the prison's use. You would almost think that the penitentiary, with its spiritual outlook and divinity-inspired architecture, would be effective in reforming its prisoners with religion. Well, in 1955, one prisoner actually was. Lester Smith, who had been convicted of multiple armed robberies, converted to Catholicism while in prison. With the Bible being the only book available, he read the scripture and painted, which was a hobby that he had taught himself, using the signature Paul Martin to honor his two favorite saints. One day, the penitentiary's Catholic chaplain, Father Edwin Geller, saw him painting in his cell and invited him to decorate the offices where the priest met and counseled prisoners. Smith accepted, and in 1955, he had painted 23 murals, each with beautiful, vulnerable art. The most striking mural is named The Penitent Prisoner, which depicts a kneeling prisoner seeking forgiveness from God. Smith's paintings set apart the Catholic chaplain's room from others and are testaments to someone who underwent a powerful change while in prison. But just what is a prison, if not its famous prisoners, you ask? Eastern State was home to all manner of prisoners, most notably the Chicago gangster Al Capone and the infamous bank robber Willie Sutton. On May the 17th, 1929, Al Capone, Scarface himself, was returning from a trip to Atlantic City when his journey was cut short. Capone was arrested outside a Philadelphia movie theater for carrying an illegally concealed and unlicensed .38 revolver. Philadelphia courts were tough and gave him the maximum sentence of 1 year in prison. Capone was sent to Eastern State to serve out his sentence, but while the courts wanted to make an example of him, the prison treated him as an esteemed guest. Philadelphia newspapers reported that Capone's cell had lavish furniture, beautiful rugs, tasteful oil paintings, and a radio that he used to listen to waltzes. But despite this high-class treatment, Capone was not all that eager to get out of the clink. You see, his arrest lined up perfectly with the rise of mob violence in Chicago, and hence many accused him of actually hiding in prison on purpose. The mob boss denied these rumors and spent thousands of dollars trying to get himself released, but with no results. In the end, he was released after 9 months on good behavior on March the 17th, 1930. Willie Sutton is a different story, also known as Slick Willie, Willie the Actor, and the Gentleman Bandit. Sutton spent his early adulthood robbing banks, using disguises and charm, but he wasn't always successful and would get arrested multiple times throughout his career. One of his arrests was in 1934 for the brazen machine gun robbery of the Corn Exchange Bank in Philly. Luckily, he was an accomplished escape artist too, attempting at least 5 escapes during his time at Eastern State Penitentiary. Sutton details one of these escape attempts in his 1953 autobiography, Where the Money Was, where he takes credit as the mastermind behind the operation. But in reality, this escape plan was the work of 12 men led by a prisoner named Clarence Clindus, or Clinny. Clinny was a plasterer, stonemason, burglar, and forger who also had a reputation as a top-notch scavenger. Sutton himself said, quote, "If you gave Clinny 2 weeks, he could get you Ava Gardner, a famous movie actress from the time." He continues, "If you gave Clinny a year, he could get you out of prison." So it was him who came up with the idea to dig a tunnel out of Eastern State Penitentiary. Almost as if out of a movie, the crew of 12 men dug a tunnel from cell 68 using spoons and flattened cans as shovels. In 2-man teams of 30-minute shifts, the crew slowly dug an opening through the wall and into the ground, hiding the dirt in their pockets and scattering that dirt throughout the yard. Amazingly, the entrance to the tunnel escaped inspection several times, thanks to a false panel treated by Clinny to match the plaster of the cell walls. The tunnel was also reinforced with scaffolding and illuminated as a true feat of engineering. The prisoners made a system to deposit their waste and prevent noxious fumes from escaping their tunnel when it reached the prison sewer line. After months of toil, the tunnel was 38 inches wide and stretched 100 feet beyond the walls of the prison. The prisoners were ready to escape. On the morning of April the 3rd, 1945, the 12 men snuck away to cell 68 on their way to breakfast, and from there, they quickly disappeared into the tunnel. Half of the escapees were caught by the end of the day, with the rest being caught within a couple of months. 2 escapees, including Sutton, were caught within 3 minutes of freedom and were sent to the cramped, dark Klondikes. Clinny himself only made it 3 hours before being caught. In the end, their escape was a failure. Months of work focused on one moment boiled down to a flash in the pan and the capture of all who were involved. After the tunnel was found, guards filled it with ash and covered it with cement, but it wasn't all for nothing. For his part, Sutton was transferred to the escape-proof Holmesburg prison, which surprisingly to everyone, he promptly escaped from. He evaded the law for years, while his story inspired every inmate who came after him. To this day, it's the most famous escape in Eastern State history, and no doubt inspired all manner of prison-based pop culture, down to digging a tunnel with a spoon used for public perception. After Eastern State Penitentiary's creation, it quickly became the most copied building in the United States. And the same solitary confinement practices were adopted by more than 300 prisons worldwide. Spurred by its unique design, tourists flocked to Philadelphia and toured the prison in the 1830s and 40s. Charles Dickinson was one of these visitors, but after seeing the poor conditions and talking to prisoners whose minds were fragile and weak, he came away appalled and wrote that solitary confinement was, quote, torturing of the mind that is much worse than any other physical punishment that can be administered. He was not the only one who held the sentiment. A series of investigations into the Eastern States' finances, punishment practices, and deviations from the Pennsylvania system have been going on for years. Solitary confinement was officially abandoned in 1913, but truthfully, the system had broken down decades before. Now cells were shared by 2 to 3 prisoners, but this only gave the penitentiary the chance to carry out its punishment in new ways. In the 1920s and 30s, Warden Hubert Hardboil Smith, as they called him, ruled over the prison with an iron fist. During his reign, prisoners rioted and set fire to their cells over low wages, overcrowding, and a lack of recreational facilities. But every riot was put down with a strong show of force. This was also the time when the Klondikes were starting to be used again. Eastern State became a place prisoners were only sent if the state believed that they needed Smith's brutal reform tactics. Which is ironic, considering that the reason it was created in the first place was because people felt current punishments were far too harsh. So how did this prison, which inspired hundreds across the globe, ultimately fall apart? Well, the answer lies in Eastern State's creation. The Pennsylvania prison system, also known as the separate system, became too costly to maintain. It required prisoners to feel completely isolated from the moment they walked in. Each prisoner had their own cell, their own exercise yard, food had to be delivered individually through feed doors, and exercise times had to be carefully scheduled to prevent neighboring inmates from interacting with one another. Critics also protested against the negative effects of solitary confinement, which we now know were worse than they could have ever imagined. Within the prison, prisoners weren't just isolated. It felt as if no one else even existed. They did everything alone, from eating to bathing. And in the process, they weren't even allowed to speak to themselves. They were drowning in utter silence, with guards wearing felt covers on their shoes to reduce the noise they made. And when they did leave the cell, a hood was frequently put over their head so they couldn't see any other human being. It was psychological torture at its finest. Although it could be argued that the Philadelphia Society meant well, modern science tells us that the use of solitary confinement is one of the worst possible punishments that they could carry out. Humans are social creatures, and it's widely agreed that we have a fundamental need for connection. Even as far back as 50 years ago, research linked social isolation and sensory deprivation with slowed brain activity. Even just 1 week in solitary could lead to significant changes in the brain, resulting in damage to learning, memory, and awareness, qualities that were most often just exchanged for highlighted anxiety and fear. Research also shows that social deprivation can cause people to experience social pain, which the brain processes the same way as physical pain. And with that in mind, if prisoners had existing mental illnesses, which they are likely to have had, then solitary confinement only made them worse. In fact, it can also lead to prisoners developing new mental illnesses, such as anxiety, depression, insomnia, PTSD, paranoia, and psychosis. Prisoners in solitary confinement are 3 times more likely to have hypertension, 3 times more likely to hurt themselves, and 5 times more likely to end their lives. So, for many valid reasons, the Pennsylvania system was abandoned. In its place came the Auburn system, which was inspired by the Philadelphia Society. Originating in 1819 in Auburn, New York, this system had prisoners eat and work together, but not speak during these activities. The system also believed the prisoners had the potential to corrupt each other if they had too much contact, so they were held in solitary confinement cells at night. But with the loss of one punishment came the rise of many others. Whenever a prisoner stepped out of line or even spoke, they were met with lashing by a leather strap, the water bath, the hole, or the mad chair. The lashings are self-explanatory, and we've already covered the hole, also known as the Klondikes, but the other punishments require a little more detail. The water bath involved dunking a prisoner in ice-cold bath water and then hanging them out to dry overnight. The cruelest guards would save this punishment for the winter when the water froze on the prisoner's skin. For the mad chair, prisoners were tightly strapped to a chair for hours or sometimes days before being released. Their movement and circulation was restricted for so long that prisoners spent days recovering from the punishment, often unable to walk. Some prisoners even lost their limbs to amputation when the circulation didn't return. With that being said, Eastern State Penitentiary was a truly awful place, with many prisoners ending their lives to escape punishment in one form or another. And it's no wonder that the Pennsylvania legislature recommended abandoning the penitentiary in 1945, followed by investigations lasting until 1959. But what happened next all but sealed the prison's fate. In 1961, John Clausenberg tricked a guard into opening the cell of another prisoner, Manuel Magendral. Together, they overpowered the guard and started the largest riot in the prison's history. Several hours later, a large force of policemen, guards, and state troopers were assembled to reclaim the prison. They regained control, but the riots fueled more discussion about Eastern State's closure. Almost as if to sign a death warrant, the federal government designated the penitentiary a National Historic Landmark in 1965, before it finally closed down permanently just 5 years later. Most of the prisoners were sent to the State Correctional Institution at Gradeford. But funny enough, the building housed more prisoners from the Holmesburg County Prison after a riot there. Eastern State Penitentiary formally closed its doors in 1971, but its building remains in Philadelphia as a very haunting scar. After Eastern State Penitentiary closed and all the remaining prisoners had been moved out, the city of Philadelphia purchased the building for $400,000. They thought it could be renovated and transformed into anything from an apartment complex to a mall, but instead it sat and collected dust for decades. Hence, the Philadelphia Streets Department used the penitentiary grounds for storage, and the last city caretaker, Dan McLeod, fed the colony of stray cats that took up residence in the empty halls. Vandals smashed skylights and windows while an urban forest grew in its halls and cells. It wasn't until 1988 that the Eastern State Task Force was formed, made up of architects, preservationists, and historians. They convinced the city to preserve the prison, rather than turn it into something else. Mayor Wilson Goode urged the Redevelopment Authority to reject all proposals for commercial use of the property, and limited tours started later that year. At first, tourists needed to wear hard hats to tour the crumbling prison, but after extensive stabilization efforts that began in 1991, tourists no longer needed one. The first of its popular Halloween fundraisers also started this year, allowing visitors to tour the prison as a haunted house. The Terror Behind the Walls event had been held every year since. Eastern State Penitentiary opened for daily historic tours in 1994, receiving 10,000 visitors in its first year, which notably is more than the original prison had since 1858. In 1996, permanent museum exhibits were constructed and a marketing campaign for the prison began. And then finally, mass popularity came when Eastern State was featured in the Bruce Willis movie, 12 Monkeys. In 1998, Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site Incorporated was formed, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving, interpreting, and teaching the history of the infamous prison. Then, in 2003, to celebrate the 10th season of public tours, the Voice of Eastern State audio tour was introduced. Upon entering the prison, you are provided with an MP3 player and headphones that will guide you through the prison and its history. The 30-minute audio tour, narrated by actor Steve Buscemi, instructs you on where to turn and what to look at while in the prison. The tour takes you past many cells and is frequently interrupted by stories of former wardens, guards, and even prisoners. There are also stops for subjects like escapes, sports, sexuality, race, and more. Even though officially it only lasts a half hour, your visit will likely span at least 2. While much of the prison has been kept in its original decaying state to make the venue feel more authentic, other parts have been restored. The penitentiary synagogue, which was used continuously until the prison closed, fell into disrepair during abandonment. But when the building was being preserved, it was the first truly restored space, returning to its appearance from 1959. A set of workshops next to the synagogue have been converted into the William Porter Memorial Exhibit on Jewish life, and one of Lester Smith's beautiful murals in the Catholic chaplain's office. Well, they also suffered extensive damage during abandonment, but ultimately have been conserved. In 2005, marking the 60th anniversary of Clinny and Sutton's escape, the Eastern State nonprofit conducted a series of architectural surveys to find their tunnel. Using a ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the estimated location of the tunnel until they found a part that hadn't collapsed or been filled in by the guards. A rover was sent in to see what remains of the scaffolding and lighting, but no major discoveries were made. Still, the curiosity about this famed tunnel caused the public's interest in Eastern State to be newly ignited. Today, Eastern State Penitentiary is open 12 months a year and 7 days a week. Other than Halloween, it has special events year-round, such as the Winter Adventure Tours, prison uprisings, and Bastille Day celebrations. The Philadelphia Society, which created Eastern State and in turn the modern prison, survives today, is the Pennsylvania Prison Society, promoting correctional reform and social justice. Over its dreadful years as a prison, Eastern State has built up a reputation of being one of the most haunted places in the country. Hauntings, spiritual encounters, and sightings are all a part of this prison's folklore. One of the most well-known stories comes from a locksmith who was hired to remove part of cell block 14. While removing a lock, he was overcome by a sudden feeling of dread as the faces of agonizing prisoners lined the walls. Another commonly reported sighting is that of giggling coming from the prison cells. Even Al Capone felt something was amiss, complaining about being haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the victims of the Valentine's Day Massacre he was a part of. The Penitentiary has been featured on the Travel Channel's Most Haunted Live, Fox's World's Scariest Places, MTV's Fear, and Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters. Footage captured in Cell Block 12 from Ghost Hunters may be the most controversial ghost sighting in history.